I need help figuring out what is happening in my neighborhood. I live in a very secluded, woodsy part of a small southern town. It's really peaceful during the day, but it gets a little messed up at night. There's a few houses on my road, but for the most part, it's only trees. There are a few reoccurring events that are all pretty spooky, but the one main one is what my friends and I call the Dogman, for the lack of a better name. I've only seen it twice in my life. I have lived in this part of town for 3 years now. The Dogman has a body shaped like that of a scrawny human. Its bones are very visible. It has fur, but only in patches over its body, sort of like a dog with mange. Though it has the bodily proportions and composition of a person, it has the head of a dog and can run extremely fast. Also, it's huge. It is a quadruped. To preface, my room is at the front of the house. Our front yard is the size of a field. I have the biggest window in the house in my bedroom, and it faces the very front yard. I do not have blinds over my window, and my bed is in front of it. The first time I saw the Dogman, it was late at night, and I was sitting in bed. I saw it running through my yard. Shortly after, my cat, who was an indoor-outdoor cat at the time, came inside growling. The cat was found dead across the creek near my yard this very July. He had no visible injuries and was very young and healthy. We still don't know how he died. The second time I saw it, it was earlier tonight. My friend and I were sitting on my porch. We noticed a very large, moving mass on the base of the mountain, which we live right in front of. We decided to get a closer look. My friend stayed behind to watch as my grandfather and I drove down the road to the base of the mountain. I didn't want to drive there alone. As we got near, we stopped in front of the mass. It was a tree. Something then sprinted out from behind it and into the woods to the right of us. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind it was the Dogman. If you have any ideas as to what the hell this is, or how I can go about finding more about it, I'd love to hear them. This is really freaking us all out. Growing up, I lived in northeastern Arizona, literally about 5 miles south of the Navajo Res in Winslow. Naturally, being that close to the res, skinwalkers were a huge topic of conversation amongst the locals, and we all took it very seriously. Stories of personal experiences abounded. I was no different. Well, to start off my set of stories, I was about 8 or 9. My family had gone camping in a little spot about 50 miles or so south of a town called Hart Canyon, near Wiggins Crossing, if anyone is interested. We had been there all day, and I was extremely familiar with the area as we had camped there 20 or so times before. So my parents let me just wander about alone in the woods. This was back in the early 90s. Anyway, I had some G.I. Joes that I had been playing with in the nearby creek, about 80 yards from our campsite. There were not other campers there with us. My mom had called me back to camp for dinner, so I left and ate. Played around camp for a while and realized that I'd forgotten my toys back at the creek. So I took a flashlight and headed back that way. I knew right where I had left them, so in no time I found them and grabbed them up. As I squatted down to grab them on the edge of the water, a sudden urgency that I'd never felt before ran down my spine. I remember feeling frozen because of the fear, like the little boy on E.T. when the alien comes out of the field for the first time, and he's trying to scream for his family. I looked up and pointed my flashlight to the other side of the creek, and about 10 yards down the way, I saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it was standing up, so I thought it might be a bear, but it was too skinny and not enough poofy hair. It skunked behind a tree and peered out slightly at me. I seriously was scared to make the first move. I had just read a bit about Bigfoot for the first time, since it wasn't really popular in my area. I thought for a long time that's what I saw. I finally had seen enough to gather my wits and scram as fast as I could back to camp. I told my parents and they kind of dismissed it as just my imagination, so I just stayed close the rest of the trip. About 2 years later, I was at my house. I had 2 dogs, and they were outside dogs, lived their whole lives in my backyard. One night, though, they went psycho, barking at first at something in the alleyway behind my house. Then they both started whimpering. I had my window open slightly, and one of my dogs straight up jumped up to the window and frantically chewed through the screen of the window, forced its way into the house, and would not leave the house for 3 days. Another time when I was about 13, we used to play night games in the town. Mostly, there being nothing much else to do, we would walk around our neighborhood and act suspicious so the cops would come chase us around. And we run down the alleyways and hop into random people's backyards to hide. Now, it was extremely common to see an intoxicated Navajo or other person in the alleyway, or even the street. So it was no big deal to see one in the alley behind my house that night, as we being 2 of my friends and myself, ran from a police car hot on our trail. We saw him plain as day standing in our way. We ran around him and jumped into the nearest yard to hide. We waited for the cop to pass us and hopped back out. Literally, about 3 minutes went by. We ran back the way we came, and as we got to the point to where the Indian had been, he was gone. Legit, in his place was a coyote sitting there, watching us. We ran right past it, feet from it, and anyone who knows coyotes know they will bail out way before you get close to them. This booger held his ground and calmly sat and watched us run past him. We all freaked out and stayed inside for a month. My last experience was when I was about 15 or 16. My brother has a girlfriend that lived in a small community south of Winslow called Starlight Pines, about 25 miles-ish. Well, we went to go see her one day, and as we drove out, about 15 miles out, we saw an Indian guy standing on the side of the road, which was quite odd because the res was north of town, and it was rare to see anyone on foot south of town, because it's just desert and forest for literally 80 miles. Anyway, we see this guy. He looked normal enough. Flannel shirt, jeans. We got to our destination and hung out with my brother's girlfriend and her family well into the night when we decided to head back home. Hopped in his truck, a Chevy S10, and drove back the way we came. In the same spot we saw the Indian dude. He was still there. I remember thinking, that dude is crazy, standing out there all day and into the night. What's he doing? Right as we passed him, we hear a loud bang on the back of the truck. At first, I thought we hit an animal, but I hadn't felt anything that we'd run over. I turned around and looked out the back window. My brother started to slow down, thinking there may be something wrong with the truck. In the brake lights, I see the Indian guy chasing after us. We were easily going 55 to 60 at this point as we're about to stop. The guy is in the road, feet behind us. I scream at my brother to not stop. Gun it, man, gun it! He does, and being a Chevy S10, it had a speed governor on it at 80. 2 miles. 2 miles. This guy keeps up with us the entire way. We are seriously freaking out. I asked my brother, what if we don't make it back to town, or what about it if we have to slow down once we get close? After those 2 miles that stretched forever, I looked back and he was gone. We got home, booked it into the house, and told our parents. The next morning, I get up and head somewhere and look at my brother's truck, thinking about the night before. I wondered what the loud bang was just before we started getting chased. Inspecting the truck, I found a handprint smeared in the dust from about 2/3 over to the right, and then smeared to the right tailgate and tail light. I never went there again. I want to share with this community a story I have not told many people. I have always believed in the paranormal, but after this encounter, it really made me think. So I hope you enjoy, and please, feel free to ask me questions about the matter. I want to hear your opinions and questions. So, I was around 14 years old when this took place. We had just moved to my grandmother's neighborhood, like 3 weeks prior. I was extremely familiar with this place, as I'd visit them every weekend. Down the road, a bit was a small pond that was in the middle of the next neighborhood over. I would regularly go down there to fish, as my dad's friend owned property on the pond. He had a very nice house with a little gazebo that protruded out into the water, just a little bit. He lived right near the small dam at the end of the lake. The dam was about 8 feet high, and on the side that wasn't facing the lake, there was a 50-foot concrete slope that went into the woods below. It was a Friday night in January, and me being the avid fisherman that I was getting ready for a trip down there the next morning. I went to bed kinda early with my dog and fishing buddy Angel. She's a Jack Russell Rat Terrier mix. I'd had her since I was 6 years old. Man's best friend, for sure. Once we got in bed, I couldn't sleep for some reason. I just tossed and turned. I finally dozed off for about an hour, but woke up for no apparent reason and couldn't go back to sleep. I looked at my phone. It was about 1:30 a.m., and after a short thought, I decided to just go on down to the pond and start fishing. I grabbed my fishing pole, tackle box, my thermos, and we started walking down to the pond. You might think I was crazy for going fishing in 20-degree weather, but I was really into fishing. Besides, I was having great luck fishing down there at night recently, so I had to go push my luck. It was a short walk to get to the lake, but I had to walk around it to the far side where I fished, which was another half a mile or so. It was really foggy that night, but I could see pretty well still because it was a full moon, or almost full. It was extremely quiet. Usually the road I was walking on is very busy at all hours, but it was too cold for anybody to be out. We made it to my dad's friend's house, and we walked down to the gazebo. I set my things down and take a drink of hot chocolate before I start getting my line ready for the water. Angel found a small place in between the wooden benches to lay down. Now, this next, but may seem unimportant, but just bear with me. Once I got my fishing pole rigged up, I casted it out and sat it down to wait for a bite. My fishing reel has a setting to where if a fish rugs on the line, it makes a very loud clicking noise to let you know that you have a bite. That's the setting I put it to. I sit down and take a look around. It was about 2:30 a.m. at this point. I look over to the left at the houses. I look over to the right towards the dam, which was about 40 feet from where I was. It still is very quiet, and I continue to look around the area, just taking in the moonlit water. Then suddenly, I see something out of the corner of my eye to my right. There, by the dam, I see a white blob walking on all fours, looking as if it's smelling the ground. It looked like a white dog from where I was, and I didn't want Angel to see it, so I picked her leash and I kept an eye on that thing. At this point, I still thought it was a dog, and I wasn't scared in the least bit. But then, as it made its way to the wall of the dam, it stood up on 2 legs. Then I realized that this was no dog. I crouched down beside the wooden bench where Angel was laying, grabbed her up, and faced her away from the creature. The thing didn't see me, and I was going to do my damnedest to make sure it never did. I intensively watched as it looked around the area, and then proceeded to jump up onto the 8-foot-tall dam effortlessly, almost as if it floated. Then it did something very strange. Its pale white skin started glowing, almost like a firefly. I could see the bluish-colored veins in its back and calf muscles. and this thoroughly freaked me out. Then it turned around to where I could see its face. It was about 3.5 feet tall, had a short torso, long skinny legs and arms, a wide head, almost oval-shaped, large ears, a large mouth, with many small teeth, and huge eyes that were yellowish-orange in color. On top of that, it was kind of glowing. I was nearly hyperventilating, trying to control my breathing, hoping the thing wouldn't hear me. Angel was now aware of its presence, and the hair on her neck stood up as she started growling and struggling to get out of my arms. I kept watching it, terrified to move. It didn't do anything when it got up to the top of the dam. It just squatted down and looked as though it was examining something in its hands. After a few minutes of watching it, I'd worked up the idea to just go back the way I came, and once I got to the road, just run as fast as I can home. Angel was growing increasingly aggressive and trying to see the creature, but I kept her buried in my big winter jacket the best I could. I decided to just leave my stuff there and come back to get it the next day. I slowly stood up, and just as I was about to start walking away from the gazebo, my fishing pole started making a very loud zzz sound. Of all the times, now I get a fish to bite. My attention went straight back to the creature, which was now frantically looking around for the source of the noise. In my panic, I forgot to keep Angel covered up, and she saw the creature for the first time. She started barking like I'd never heard her bark before, as if she was in terror or something, and that scared me. The creature then saw us there, and it bent down as if it were about to start running towards us. I tried to take a step back and start running, but I slipped on the cold, hard ground. I landed on my side and looked at the creature. Thankfully, it hadn't started to chase us, but it let out the most disturbing scream I've ever heard. It sounded like a woman screaming, but backwards if that makes sense. It then jumped from the dam into the woods, about 100 feet away, and faded as it landed. I was in tears now, and my fight or flight kicked in. I grabbed Angel, and I ran as fast as I could, all the way up to my door at my house. Too afraid to look back and see if it was behind me. I got home, and I don't really remember what happened till the next day. I must have passed out or something. I remember it seemed like it was a dream, but the next day I went to go get my gear from the gazebo. It was still there. I didn't go back to the pond, even during the day, for a few years. I told my mom and dad the story some months later, and while they believed me, I still wonder what the creature was. I think I've had an experience, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Me and my friend were walking towards a park to go and hang out at, and then we discovered the sewer system. We decided to check it out, because we were stupid. There was a grate covering it, but the bars were bent open enough that me and her could squeeze in. She had a really bad feeling about it. She's a super intuitive person when it comes to paranormal stuff, but I just ignored it and went further in. There was a big room area that the grate led into, and it had a grate on the top where a light was shining through. There was a big tunnel leading right, and a small tunnel leading up high that I couldn't reach on the left. The room was partially filled with water at the bottom, and there was some graffiti on the walls of the tunnel. As I looked to the left, it was super dark, so I couldn't see very well. But a long ways down, there was another grate, and there was some light leaking in. I could see a long lanky thing stretched out that looked really like a skinny arm. I couldn't see a body because it was further, closer to me, where it was darker, and I could only see it because it was in front of the light, so it was shining behind it and made it pop out. Sorry if this was worded weird. I don't know how else to describe it. It looked like an arm stretched out, and it wasn't moving. I ignored it, thinking it was probably just a plank of wood or something propped up, because there were some planks of wood in the room that I was in. I decided to stack some rocks by the left tunnel, so that I could reach it and look in. As I looked through the tunnel, there was another room far down the tunnel, and it had a grate on top like my room, and light was leaking in. Then I noticed this gray, hunched-over figure with an extremely bony body. It didn't have any clothes or hair from what I could see. Its body looked super malnourished. I couldn't see its head or its legs since the tunnel was really small. All I could really see was its back, part of its neck, and the tops of his arms. It also wasn't moving, and by this point, I was freaking out. I went back to my friend and told her what I saw. I asked her for her phone so I could take a picture to show her. She refused to go into there. I took the picture and then we hightailed it out. I sadly don't have the picture because the phone it was taken on had gotten lost. We have gone back a couple of times but never saw anything like it since. The tunnels were just empty. I think the figure was either a crawler or maybe a gray. If anyone has any information on grays or crawlers, please comment below. I can't find much about them. Sorry if this is badly worded. It's super late. If anyone needs me to elaborate on something, I'd be happy to do so. Anyone have any idea what it was or have anything similar happen to them? There's something haunting the woods of Mount Shasta. I don't know what it is, but I think I've seen it twice. Before I moved to Mount Shasta, I heard all of the strange stories about the area. Weird disappearances, underground alien bases, UFOs, Bigfoots, creatures. But I didn't take them seriously. I was living in the suburbs, which was as far away from anything strange as somebody can get. It's just not something you went around thinking about all the time. I lived in Mount Shasta for a couple of years before I really saw anything like the kinds of stories people tell here. Almost everyone you meet will talk about something they've seen after you get to know them a little. A couple of miles from town is a lake, Siskiyou. There's miles of trails and shoreline to hike along and swim, surrounded by hills and forests. I hope what I'm able to admit doesn't make me sound less believable, but I've used marijuana occasionally since high school, and at the time this happened, I was using it medically to help with some medical issues. It's legal in California, and not really a big deal. Most people are okay about it. To make a long story short, I wanted to grow a couple of plants on my own, so I bought some seedlings, and I went searching around in some areas of the forest in the back of Lake Siskiyou, where a series of creeks flow into it. I was trying to find a place near a water source where I could buy some plant seeds that had a lot of shrubbery and tree cover, so the plants would be hidden. This wasn't a big operation. I just wanted a few plants for my own use. We were renting a place and I didn't have any property to grow on, so it seemed like a harmless thing to do. You can understand it's partially because of this that I'm being very careful about remaining unknown. Technically, I could get in some trouble for this. It was getting near the end of summer, and me and a friend camped out in the woods behind the lake. Before dark, we took the trail to the north shore of the lake and walked up into the forest, where we set up a tent in a wooded area close to where my plants were, and slowly growing. We were trying to be very quiet and didn't use any lights, because it's illegal to camp here overnight. It was around midnight when we decided to go to the lake's north shore for a swim. Because it was too hot to fall asleep, of course. We were walking on the trail back to the lake. It was dark and felt humid, and as we continued down the path, we passed through a grassy area, and there was a mist hanging over this area at about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. But just this one area, nowhere else. I remember my friend saying something about it because it seemed so unusual to her. A little further ahead, something crashed high up in the trees above us. We were both startled by the sound of branches splitting and breaking. Whatever it was made quite a bit of noise, like something scrambling to hide. It scared the hell out of both of us. When I turned around and looked up, I saw two large glowing yellow eyes looking down from high up in the tree, but the rest of its form was hidden in the branches. It only looked down for a moment, and it must have turned away, because its shining eyes were gone a moment later. Then, there was another crashing in the limbs, like something suddenly jumping or falling, breaking more branches, but nothing hit the ground. My friend wasn't looking up when this happened. She was looking directly behind us, but she heard it and turned around. As the second crashing happened, the tree limbs high up shook, causing broken branches and limbs to fall, but nothing large like an animal hit the ground, only falling debris. It freaked us out, so we both ran and got out of there. After we were further down the trail, I told her it was probably a bear or mountain lion climbing up the tree, and we must have scared it. But I couldn't forget how large its eyes must have been. For me to have been able to see them shining so brightly from high up in that tree, and the weird mist that was only in that grassy area, it bothered me. But I didn't want to say anything more about it because I didn't want to freak out my friend for the rest of the night. It was probably about an hour later, after we went swimming on the north shore, that we saw something again. We were both sitting on the sand, having a smoke, and from behind us, we both heard a sound like huge wings flapping, coming from the forested area behind us, where a series of creeks run down a rocky drainage and flow into the back side of the lake. We both turned around at the same time and saw this large, black bat-like form soar directly over us, soaring at about the same height as the tallest trees. It crossed over the lake and then veered off towards the south, where it disappeared from view. The creature looked like a flying humanoid with bat-like wings, about the size of a tall man. It was far too big to be any kind of owl or bird, and we were both so freaked out that we didn't go back into the woods again that night. We just went back to the main campground adjacent to the lake and got in our car and drove home. I returned the next day with a friend to get our tent that we left. My girlfriend didn't want to go back there. I looked around the area to see if there were any tracks or something, remembering that someone had told me that a long time ago there were reported in the local newspaper to be three-toed tracks up on the Mount Shasta, but I couldn't find anything that looked out of the ordinary, and I've never seen anything like that since. But we don't go camping out in remote places around the mountain anymore. I never knew how widespread the sightings of these flying creatures were until after this happened to me, and I started researching it online. That's how I found out that there is some truth to the strange things people claim to see around Mount Shasta.